British New Wave was a group of films made in Great Britain in the late 50s and early 60s. And the name New Wave actually is the English translation of Nouvelle Vague, which was the French New Wave. That means New Wave in French. So it started there, and the British expropriated the name. But it really started in the mid-50s, in the post-war era, where there was a dissatisfaction with the British upper class, which most of the movies were made by. The English people were very, they were kind of depressed in the post-war era. There was a recession because they were, the whole economy and social structure was damaged so much by World War II. And then the demise of the English, not the aristocracy, but the empire was falling apart, and there's a rise of what they call the leftist Labour Party, and they appeal more to the working class. The people who were involved with these movies were novelists, and many of the movies were taken from novels of the time that depicted post-war England, and not in the London, but in other cities, industrial cities, kind of grimy and kind of dirty, sort of a response to what was going on in post-war England at the time. But there were several other trends that contributed to it, and amongst them were plays that were written by British authors that tended to depict life in the lower classes, and believe it or not, in art. And there was a wave of artists which, instead of drawing pictures of flowers and trees and portraits, pictured everyday life, like things people were eating and people were cooking. And it became known as the kitchen sink school because it showed things like the kitchen sink and toilets and things of that sort, everyday life. So that blended in to make the movies what they came to be. In fact, the literary New Wave really started the movie wave. British theater or any theater, I guess, was more, it's different than it is now, because then the theaters in London and around the country would go out and get playwrights to write them plays, because there was a lot more theater in the non-London areas, and they would try to find people to write plays for them. The first movie that kicked the thing off was called Look Back in Anger, which you may have heard of. This was a play written by a guy named John Osborne, who was, when he wrote this, a down-and-out would-be playwright living in a scruffy circumstance. And one of the theaters in London had suffered several failures, and they came to him and said, we need a new play. And he wrote a play about him fighting with his wife. And it was set in a cramped apartment where they had disagreements and a lot of ugly talk, and it was a big hit. And some of the critics said, oh, this is not good. But one critic, who was named Kenneth Tynan, you may have heard of, he said this is a wonderful play and everyone should see it. So everyone did see it. It became a huge hit, and it became eventually a movie, and it made John Osborne a star. He was nothing, and then he became this celebrated playwright and producer of movies, and he wrote many other plays as his career went on. So he was dubbed the angry young man. That this was a critic who dubbed him that, and there were other angry young men. So the whole genre became known as the angry young men of literary fame and movies.
No angry young woman.
There was one angry young woman, yes, that I know about. I haven't seen the movie, but there was a movie called A Taste of Honey. But The Taste of Honey was the only movie in this group that featured a female protagonist, and she was the product of an alcoholic mother. She was sort of homeless-ish. She got pregnant by a black sailor, sort of an accident. She was wandering around and got taken in by one of her friends who happened to be a male homosexual. And he became sort of the surrogate father for this child. So it touched on a number of subjects which were more or less taboo in British society, like out-of-wedlock pregnancy, black-white relationships, homosexuality, and so it was quite a startling thing for the British public to see, but turned out to be a big hit, and in America too. And then there were other movies, one called The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, which had to do with a young man who was imprisoned and had to become a competitive runner to suit the warden of his prison. It sounds pretty grim. We didn't get to see these movies in class, but I'm sure they're probably available either through the university or somewhere else, and I'd like to view a few of them. The people who were involved in this were the main guy. One of the main guys was a guy named Tony Richardson, who was a famous theatrical director and producer. And then he directed movies. He's probably most famous for being married to Vanessa Redgrave, by which he had 2 children. He had several other marriages, and unfortunately, he was a closet bisexual, and he developed AIDS and died of AIDS at age 61, before probably we knew what AIDS was. And he was probably the most well-known guy. Carl Wrights, a guy named Lindsay Anderson was also involved in it. The one we watched in class was Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which was not the most well-known movie of this genre, but it was the one we watched. It was a very good movie. It appealed to me because it had as its main actor, a guy that I had seen in many other movies, Albert Finney, who only died like in the 90s. Very talented guy who played a middle-class, disaffected man who was involved in one extramarital affair causing a pregnancy, lived with his parents, was very unhappy with his life, fighting against the class system and his own inability to gain in life. It was directed by a guy named Carl Reis, R-E-I-S-Z. The Saturday Night and Sunday Morning comes from the fact that he worked as a factory worker all week, and then on Saturday he would get drunk and have sex with his mistress, who was married to one of his co-workers. And then Sunday he would sober up in time to go back to work. He lived with his parents. He looked down on their middle-class values. His dad just sat in front of the television all day. His mistress got pregnant. There was some discussion of what to do about this. The word abortion was never mentioned, but clearly that was an option for them. And the girl tried to get an abortion. So this covered a lot of issues that weren't really covered in British film, like the middle class in a gritty, non-London setting, usually a town in the north of England like Manchester, Nottingham, very down at the heels industrial cities. And he subsequently formed a friendship with more of a middle-class girl, and at the end he's led into what he probably feels is going to be a drab existence with his new girlfriend. Not the pregnant one, but another one. He gets beat up too. That's part of it. This was really the main theme of British movies until Bond came along. And actually the Bond movies were English actors, but it was mostly American money. And it was made for an international audience and American audience, and the British just thought the British critics they said, no, this is not British, this is made for money and so forth. And then the swinging 60s came along, like Michael Caine and the mod culture, swinging London, remember that, with Carnaby Street and all that, and that kind of chucked the new wave. So it only lasted 5 or 6 years. But it was a lot of fun to see the movies, and there's a lot of good history, a lot of good cultural history covering art, literature, movies. brought into English consciousness all these things that were going on that they really didn't talk about. The things I've mentioned, like, well, mostly sexual, but also abortion, homosexuality, the kind of bad circumstances that people were living in outside of London. That was not in the movies.